Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. I was watching The Unexplained with Captain Kirk, William Shatner, and the subject was on imposters. Folks who pretend to be people they're not, and they manage to get away with it, and sometimes for years. It doesn't take much to tell people you are someone or something that you're not. As long as you're not called on to perform skills you lay claim to but don't have. You can say you know anything. You can tell people you're a welder all day long. Putting a bead on a piece of metal will tell folks if you're telling the truth or just flapping your gums. Back when I was young, TV was a lot different than it was today. The trouble was, movies had to be chopped up in order to add commercials and remove anything considered too violent or nasty for a TV audience. We would gather in the living room and watch whatever my dad wanted to see. The shows were always picked democratically. We could ask to watch anything he wanted to watch. One movie we did get to watch was called The Great Imposter, starring Tony Curtis. It was based on the true-life adventures and misadventures of a man who went through life pretending to be people that he was not. Actors do this all the time, and some of them begin to believe they're actually as talented as the folks they're portraying. Tony Curtis looked nothing like the man he was pretending to be. They should have used Sidney Greenstreet. That might have been a bit hard since Greenstreet died 4 years before The Great Imposter was filmed. That would have been a Weekend at Bernie's kind of thing. Tor Johnson looked a lot more like the man in the movie. Tor wasn't known for his acting ability. He had been a pro wrestler until Ed Wood discovered him and began putting Tor in movies, usually as either a monster or the heavy. I just wanted to get the point across that Ferdinand Wald Demara was a bit heavier than Tony Curtis. Here's a little known bit of history. Tony Curtis married Janet Leigh, the actress in the shower scene in Psycho. The blood was actually Hershey's chocolate syrup since it was filmed in black and white. Curtis and Lee had a daughter named Jamie Lee Curtis of Halloween fame. The Great Imposter was based on the true life of a man who didn't have the patience for a normal way of advancement that people rarely question you if your papers are in order. He becomes a soldier, a sailor, a monk, a surgeon on board a Canadian warship, a prison guard, and a priest. I sometimes tell people I'm pretending to be a writer and a podcaster, but Demara went way beyond anything I ever dreamed of. Ferdinand Wald Demara Jr. was born December 21st, 1921, in Lawrence, Massachusetts. His father had a good paying job, and the family lived on the nice side of town. His father, Ferdinand Wald Demara Sr., was born in Rhode Island, and he worked in Lawrence's old theater district as a motion picture operator. Demara Sr. was financially well off, and the family lived on Jackson Street in Lawrence, an upper-class neighborhood. Demara Sr.'s brother, Napoleon Louis Demara Sr., owned many of the theaters in Lawrence, in which Demara Sr. was an active union member. Early on in the Great Depression, Fred's father became financially insolvent, losing not just his means of earning a living, but his savings as well. This change in financial standing forced the family to move from the Tower Hill neighborhood to the poorest section in the city. Demara had gotten used to living in a nice home in a better side of town. He'd been in this position for the first 9 years of his life. The sudden change in both the money for living and the house they were in did not set well with him. He had been attending one of the best schools in town, and now Demara was in one of the lower educational establishments. Some folks believe all public schools are the same. Right. The schools in bad neighborhoods are not going to attract the best teachers. The buildings and teaching aids are not going to be the best either. There was a school south of town with little financial ability. A well-off person bought a bunch of computers for the kids to learn with. Late one night, one of the local pillars of society broke in and stole several of the new machines. The computers that he didn't steal, he smashed them all. For a kid coming from the best and being placed in one of the worst schools, it was hard for Demara to adjust. This could have been the spark needed to put the fire under Demara to live life pretending to be people that he was not. During the few years left in his public education, Demara convinced a local businessman to donate a bunch of chocolate to the kids in his class. I searched for the whole story, but I couldn't track down the details, just the overall story. It had something to do with a contest at the school. In 1935, after attending the school for 7 years, Demara called it quits. He packed his bags and he went to find a new direction. Lacking the skills to succeed in organizations he was drawn to, he wanted the status that came with being maybe a priest or an academic or a military officer. He didn't have the patience to achieve the necessary qualifications. At 16 years of age, with a desire to become a member of the Silent Order of Trappist monks, Demara ran away from his home in Lawrence, Massachusetts, lying about his age in order to gain entry. Lying is easy. Lying and being believed is a little trickier. The lie has to be believable. Something small, like your age, can slip by simply because a lot of people won't dig too deep, especially if they are in need of people of a certain age to join. When I was a lot younger, the drinking age was 18. I would walk into a liquor store and buy a case of beer several times a month. The folks working there never asked me for my ID because I looked a lot older than I was. I was 16 and I dropped out of school. I was 6 feet tall and I weighed 200 pounds. I was working in a steel reclamation yard, kind of like an overdone junkyard. I made sure to wear my hard hat so the clerks all knew I was working and I had money. The first time I was ever carded was when I was already 30 years old and I was having to buy some beer for a shift party. I had given up drinking a while ago. I got tired of waking up in my truck, doing 90. When Demara was found by his parents, he was allowed to stay because they figured he would probably give up soon. Demara remained with the monks long enough to gain his hood and habit, but he was forced out of the monastery at the age of 18 because his fellow monks figured he just didn't have the right temperament. He was the kind of guy who wanted to be in charge. He didn't much like having others telling him when to do things and what to do. Frank attempted to join other orders, including the Brothers of Charity Children's Home in West Newbury, Massachusetts, but again failed to follow the rules. He wound up stealing some money and a car from the home, drove off, and then joined the Army in 1941 at the age of 19. As it turned out, the Army wasn't really for him either. He disliked military life so much that after about a year he stole a friend's identity and fled. Now, going by the name of Anthony Ignolia, Demara went to a few other monasteries trying to find a new home. He joined the Abbey of Our Lady of Gethsemane, a Trappist monastery in Kentucky, using his assumed identity. He ran in to an acquaintance from the first monastery he'd been at, and so he was forced to flee once again. The world is a big place. You can move around and not run into too many people you've already encountered. Joining a small, tight-knit organization, you will encounter folks you're trying to avoid. He moved to the new Mellery Abbey near Dubuque, Iowa, before finally returning home. His father encouraged his son to turn himself in to the military police because he was a deserter from the Army, but Demara said nay, nay. If Army life wasn't for him, just imagine military life in prison. Instead, he went looking for another monastery to join. Monastic life didn't get along with him. Too many rules, kind of like being in the Army. There was always somebody around telling him what to do. Eventually, Demara decided to join the Navy. For someone who didn't like following rules, he sure chose some establishments to join. Those who never joined the military, there are differences between the branches. They are still kind of the same. I don't know about today, but back in the day, there was yelling and screaming and lots of sleepless nights. You had drill and ceremony, marching, in all military units. The food was bad, and it felt like it was never going to end. Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and the Air Force. Some are harder than others, but if you couldn't hang in the Army, switching to the Navy wasn't going to be any easier. Demara had other ideas, and so he went from one branch to the other. The trouble a lot of imposters run into is they forget what they said yesterday, or they embellish their story to a point it becomes very hard to believe. Demara was able to remember what he told people and keep his backstory believable. It helped him a great deal, having photographic memory. He could read up on the person he wanted to impersonate and then have all the details squirreled away, ready to give out at a moment's notice. He was able to remember what he said last week, last month, last year. This helped him maintain his persona. He learned early on in his career if somebody began asking too many questions, go on the offensive. Get the accuser to look a bit foolish in the eyes of those around them, making the questions stop real quick. In the Navy, Demara, aka Anthony Ignolia, became a corpsman, the Navy's version of medical techs. Corpsmen are trained to recognize medical problems, and they're allowed to treat many, freeing up the doctors to worry about the more involved things. Once more, Demara found he may have chosen the wrong place to be. Being in the Navy was constricting as being in the Army. Mostly the only difference was the uniform. In a bid for freedom, Demara faked his own suicide. He was able to literally play dead long enough to be shipped to the local morgue, where he made good his escape, if that's the right term. Borrowing another name from a fellow sailor, Robert Linton French, he added the title Doctor and forged a few documents to prove his position in life. He managed to become a religion-oriented psychologist. Dr. French then presented himself at the new Subiaco Abbey, which was a Benedictine monastery in Arkansas, as a would-be Catholic convert. After a few weeks, he was summoned to the abbot's office, where he was accused of having forged his documents. He denied the accusations, but he left the monastery. He moved to Chicago, where he joined the Clerics of St. Viator before moving to the Order of St. Camillus in Milwaukee. After once more arguing with his superiors, this time over his lack of cooking skills, he left and he moved to New Jersey, where he joined the Paulist Novitiates in Oak Ridge. He moved around quite a lot. It didn't matter that he had no formal education. He managed to forge some documents that said he was who he claimed to be, and he'd attended college in all the right places. He looked good and he sounded good. By reading up on his chosen field, he was able to say all the right things at the right times, making everybody around him believe that he was a psychologist and professor. As Dr. French, he applied for various jobs at Catholic College and was eventually employed to teach psychology at Gannon College in Erie, Pennsylvania. Being made dean of the School of Philosophy, he taught general psychology, industrial psychology, and abnormal psychology. He also published a well-received booklet titled How to Bring Up Your Children. Funny, seeing as he had no children or training on how to raise them. He left after an unfortunate incident involving some forged checks. He was briefly a member of the Benedictine St. Bede's Abbey in Peru, Illinois, before joining the Brothers Hospitallers of St. John of God. Meanwhile, the FBI had been out looking for a deserter from the Navy. They soon caught up with him. Probably had something to do with a missing body at the morgue. Had the FBI looked a bit deeper, they would have discovered that Demara was also a deserter from the Army. The U.S. Army had started using fingerprints back in 1905. Within 3 years, the Navy and the Marine Corps also started using fingerprints. They were not used for anything other than personal identification. The service didn't waste their time looking for deserters because they usually wound up coming back on their own anyway. There was really no reason to look any deeper. The FBI were looking for one Anthony Ignolia, United States Navy, deserter. They had his personnel file with his photograph and fingerprints. The image was the same as the man sitting in front of them. They asked Fred to identify himself, and he told them he was Anthony Ignolia. He was arrested and prosecuted as being this person. They didn't have access to a huge computer database. All they had was what was written in the file. Demara was bright enough to only tell them what they already knew. He admitted to faking his own death and sneaking out of the morgue. He admitted to using the alias Robert Linton French. The FBI had a service number that had been assigned to Demara when he enlisted. The military used to have a service number instead of a social security number. You would have two different numbers attached to your name. 1969, the Army and the Air Force dropped the service number and just went with the Social and Security number. 1972, the Navy and the Marine Corps followed suit. Demara held on to his identity as being Anthony Ignolia, and he served 18 months at the Naval Disciplinary Barracks in San Pedro, California, for being a deserter. After his release, he assumed a fake identity and he studied law at night at Northeastern University, and then he joined the Brothers of Christian Instruction in Maine, a Roman Catholic order. While at the Brothers of Christian Instruction, he became acquainted with a young doctor named Joseph C. Sire. The two got along well, and Demara learned all he could, and not on how to be a doctor, but about the doctor he wanted to become. During Demara's impersonation as Brother John Payne of the Christian Brothers of Instruction, he decided to make the religious teachings order more prominent by funding a college in Alfred, Maine. Demara proceeded on his own and actually got the college chartered by the state. He then promptly left the religious order in 1951 when the Christian Brothers of Instruction offended him by not naming him as the rector or chancellor of the new college and chose what Demara considered to be a terrible name for the college, La Manias. Later on, the college was moved to Canton, Ohio. In 1960 became the Walsh College, which then became Walsh University. Sometime around 1952, Demara joined the Canadian Navy. The war in Korea had been kicked off recently, and the military on both sides of the border were looking for people who could keep their fighting men alive. Why would he keep joining the military if he always found he didn't fit? It wasn't the military, it was the position he held while in there. As an E1, enlisted no class, if you will, the lowest member of the Army and Navy, he was told what to do and when to do it. Any doctor willing to enlist was given the rank starting at O3, or Officer 3, which is a captain in the Army or a lieutenant in the Navy. You can get higher depending on your experience. Demara showed up with papers saying he was not just a doctor, but an experienced surgeon, a Dr. Sire. This would have brought him in as an O5 or commander. Stop to think about it. Here's a guy with a basic understanding of how to keep the human body functioning, enlisting as a Navy surgeon, not knowing what kinds of traumatic injuries might show up on his table, making him responsible for fixing them. A bit about Navy surgeons. Way back when ships used sails to get from place to place, if you got sick or injured, you were at the mercy of anyone who had an idea on how to fix what ailed you. As for medicine, well, you got whatever was laying around the back room. As countries went to war, it became necessary to have somebody on board with at least a basic knowledge of medicine. This was mostly to keep the ship's officers alive. If the deck crew got injured or sick, they were squeezed in between the higher-ups. The common cure for injuries was amputation. They had some weird ideas on how to cure people. Things like mercury to fix just about everything. Most doctors tended to stay at home and make a good living, so anybody unable to make it in civilian life could join the Navy and make a few bucks while pretending to cure illnesses and mend bones. People died all the time, and no one was going to see why so many died while in the care of one particular doctor. Not all ship's doctors were bad, but there were way too many who didn't know an aneurysm from a prolapsed colon. After years of neglect, somebody discovered if the fighting men were kept alive, they could continue fighting. You didn't have to go looking for new men to serve on board your ships. Ship's doctors were scrutinized to be sure they could fix broken bones and keep Kuru at bay. There actually is a disease called Kuru, but I won't get into that right now. Just think cannibalism, and we'll keep going. The need for trained doctors would increase as any war was declared. Fighting men tended to get injured, and somebody needed to fix them so they could go back to fighting. To entice doctors to join, the pay was increased and the status as well. When Dr. Joseph C. Sire showed up at the Navy recruiting office in Canada and handed over his paperwork, the guys behind the desk were more than happy to sign him up. A little something called enlistment bonuses might have helped. Recruiters get a bonus if they sign up the right people. His first assignment was at the RCN Hospital in the Navy port of Halifax. He was to take sick call despite having no real knowledge of advanced medicine. As any great con man would do, he managed to get other people to do the actual diagnosing until he could get up to speed. While doing rounds, he couldn't run back to his room to check his textbooks, so he created a quick reference he could keep tucked away in his lab coat. He told his supervisor men working in lumber camps were facing some pretty bad injuries and sicknesses. He, Demara, was putting together a field manual that could be read by anyone with an ability to understand English. How to recognize and treat illnesses and injuries. His supervisor thought this was an outstanding idea, and he was more than happy to give his input. The notes contained just about every illness or injury you might find in the woods or at a Navy hospital. Demara used the notes to pretend to recognize all the problems presented in the hospital. Anything too minor to have been put in the notes wasn't going to get him in trouble if he just winged it. As the war in Korea drug on, Dr. Sire, better known as Fred Demara, was assigned as a trauma surgeon aboard the HMCS Cayuga, a Royal Canadian Navy destroyer. After reporting for duty, he told his subordinates to take care of any minor things without needing to bother him. This was what the subordinates wanted to hear. More leeway, no over-the-shoulder supervision, and being able to perform more neat tasks. You don't become a corpsman hoping to play second fiddle to some know-it-all doctor. Being the guy who can make the pain go away is a big perk. I hate to put it to you this way, but it's kind of like being a doctor without all that time spent in college. Demara, or Dr. Sire, managed to improvise successful major surgeries and fend off infection with a generous amounts of penicillin. Just before any surgeries were scheduled, Demara would go to his cabin and quickly read up on how the head bone was connected to the neck bone, things like that. Some medical treatments are so basic a caveman could do it. Others are so complicated, surgeons contact other surgeons for a consult. Being the only surgeon on board the destroyer made consults undoable. Demara was on his own, yet somehow he managed to keep the crew alive and well. Demara, posing as Dr. Sire, was living large and basking in his position up until that fateful day 16 North Korean soldiers were brought on board. When the fertilizer hits the oscillating air mechanism, someone has to step up and do the right thing. Demara ordered the patients to be taken to the surgery, and he ran to his cabin for a quick look at surgery for dummies. Actually, he flipped through several textbooks on how to perform surgery, and then he went to his station. Picture it, Sicily, 1922. Oh, wrong place. A surgery ward on board a destroyer filled with bleeding men who all needed surgery to fix their broken bones. Demara stepped in and cut one patient's chest open. He stuck his hand inside and he found the severed artery. He removed a bullet and he stopped the bleeding. A corpsman was told to close the chest wound as Demara went to work on the next victim, or patient. After several hours of cutting and poking and pulling, all 16 men were alive. Not only did they survive surgery, they all improved. Word got out that Dr. Sire had saved 16 men's lives, even though they were all prisoners, by performing surgery on them. This word made it into the newspapers back home in Canada. One person who read the account was quite impressed, yet very confused. Dr. Sire's mother began wondering, when had her son joined the Navy? How did he get stationed on the other side of the planet in such a short time, since she'd seen him just a few weeks ago? Her son, at the time of his service in Korea, was actually practicing medicine in Grand Falls, New Brunswick. The doctor's mother placed a call to her son, who contacted the newspapers to find out if this was a misprint. The newspapers got a hold of the Navy, and the Navy got a hold of the captain of the HMCS Cayuga. Oops, the old fertilizer was once more introduced to the oscillating air mechanism. Captain James Plomer, commanding officer of the Cayuga, refused to believe that his doctor wasn't the real thing. He had watched as Dr. Sire performed surgeries on his crew. Besides, the Navy had sent this man to him identified as being a well-trained surgeon. A close look was given to Demara's credentials, and his documents were found to be fakes. Things were looking bad for Fred. Things were looking even worse for the Canadian Navy. How could they allow a fake doctor to perform medicine on their sailors? If the Navy decided to press charges against Demara, the whole story would come out on how the recruiters and the higher-ups all were taken in by fake diplomas and certificates. Demara was removed from his position as ship's surgeon and returned to the United States. I wonder if he got to keep his pay for the time he was a commander in the Navy. After returning from the war without any medals or retirement pay, Demara sold his bizarre story to Life magazine. He got some small jobs here and there, just doing whatever he could, just to make money to live. His image became fairly well known. The call of adventure is hard to ignore. Demara began to think about how great it had been to be the man of authority and status. As a ship's surgeon, he'd been right up there with the greats. He began looking for his next mountain to summit. In 1955, Demara created some fake documents using the name Ben Jones, and then he headed to Texas. Once there, he presented himself at the Texas Department of Corrections in Huntsville. The hiring board looked at the resume, and they decided they had found a willing and able guard, a supervisor of guards at that. Demara was hired as a prison officer. As Jones, Demara began working as a guard at the Huntsville prison in Texas and was eventually put in charge of the maximum security wing that housed the most dangerous prisoners. Prisoners are cunning and devious. Well, Demara was cunning and devious as well. It takes one to know one kind of thing. Seeing as he knew how to get folks to like him and listen to him, Demara was able to keep control of his section. He was eventually promoted to Assistant Warden. In 1956, an educational program that provided prisoners with magazines to read led to Demara's discovery once more. One of the prisoners found the Life magazine article, and he showed the cover picture of Demara to the prison officials. Word quickly spread that the guy from the Canadian Navy was now working at the prison. Demara was forced to leave. Despite categorically denying to the prison warden that he was Demara, and pointing to the positive feedback he had received from prison officials as well as inmates about his performance there, Demara decided it was time to run. Impersonating a prison official is a serious crime. Yet, was he really impersonating an official, seeing as they had hired him? He'd been impersonating a civilian named Jones, who got hired as a prison guard. Too many gray areas here to be sure, but he was in trouble. On a cold November morning in 1956, a pair of police officers traveled to a small Maine community of North Haven Island to arrest the local schoolteacher. The man, Martin Goddard, was beloved by his students. He led the Sea Scouts, and he taught at the local Sunday school and even played Santa Claus. He was also Ferdinand Wald Demara, the Great Imposter. Those who knew him as being Martin Goddard were surprised to discover he'd been arrested up until they found out who he really was. He was becoming well known as the guy in the Life magazine article. November 5th, 1959, Demara appeared on a game show hosted by Ernie Kovac called Take a Good Look. The object was for one of three celebrity panelists to guess his identity. 1 week later, November 12th, 1959, he appeared on an episode of the TV show called You Bet Your Life with Groucho Marx. Demara recounts his exploits and said that the $1,000 he earned on the program was going to be donated to the Feed and Clothe Fred Demara Fund. Demara continued to use new aliases, but as a result of his self-generated publicity, it became much harder to accomplish impersonations than before. In 1960, as a publicity stunt, Demara was given a small acting role in the horror film The Hypnotic Eye. He appears briefly in the film as a hospital surgeon. By this point, Demara's girth was so noticeable that he could not avoid attracting attention. Fred was already considered overweight during his impersonation of Joseph Sire. Demara told his biographer he was successful in his role because he was able to fit into positions which nobody else had previously occupied. Demara explained in the following excerpt from his biography. He had come to two beliefs. One was that in any organization there is always a lot of loose, unused power laying about which can be picked up without alienating anyone. The second rule is, if you want power and you want to expand, never encroach on anyone else's domain. Open up a new one instead. Demara referred to it as expanding into the power vacuum and described as such. If you come into a new situation, don't join any other professor's committee. Try to make your mark by moving up in that committee. You will, 1, have a long haul, and 2, make enemies. Demara's technique was to find his own committee. That way there's no competition, no past standards to measure you by. How can anyone tell you aren't running a top outfit? And then there's no past laws or rules or precedents to hold you down or limit you. Make your own rules and interpretations. Remember it. Expand into the power vacuum. Later on in 1960, Demara worked as a counselor at the Union Rescue Mission in downtown Los Angeles. Still no degrees or training. He used his knowledge of how people would think to help guide those in need. It's funny how some of the best counselors come from those with the least amount of formal training. Living life is one of the best educations out there. The old splinter of experience thing. I've met and worked with and around some folks who went to college and read a bunch of books on things like addiction and life's problems. They strut around acting as if they know all there is to know about addiction, and therefore all you need do is listen to them and you'll be cured. They got all their information from someone else who probably never left the campus library. I've also met and worked with some folks who at one time lived under a bridge or in a flophouse. Drug addicts and alcoholics who are alive today only because God has some plans for them. With all the experience Demara had getting people to believe he was someone else, he gained an ability to convince others they might just be a lot better off than they thought they were. A salvation a la mode and a cup of tea. That's for you Jethro Tull fans. Still, his past kept catching up with him. Someone would recognize him as being that guy in the magazine, and then questions would be asked. Just when and where did you go to college to get your degree in helping those who can't help themselves? In 1967, Demara actually received a graduate certificate from Multnomah School of the Bible in Portland, Oregon. His first ministerial assignment was a pastor of a Cherry Grove Baptist Church in Gaston, Oregon. He was very well liked, but soon plagued with rumors about his old life, causing him to resign the position. Many parishioners felt this was yet another con, though many others thought that he was taking the position seriously and had legitimate credentials. When Demara's past exploits and infamy were discovered in late 1970, he was almost dismissed from the Good Samaritan Hospital of Orange County in Anaheim, California, where he worked as a visiting chaplain. A chief of staff, Philip S. Caffarelli, who had developed a close personal friendship with Demara, personally vouched for him, and Demara was allowed to remain as chaplain. Fred was a very active and appreciated minister and served a variety of patients in the hospital. A few of those with whom he interacted at the hospital knew of his colorful past. Due to limited financial resources and his friendship with Cifarelli and Jerry Nielsen, one of the major owners of the hospital, Demara was allowed to live in the hospital until his death, even after illness forced him to stop working for them in 1980. He had various friendships with a variety of notable people during his life, including a close relationship with actor Steve McQueen, to whom Demara delivered the last rites in November 1980. Steve McQueen was an action actor playing in such great movies as Bullet, a Manhunter. He smoked a lot of a particular kind of cigarette that had asbestos filters. They thought this was a good thing. McQueen developed some nasty cancerous growths in his lungs, which eventually led to his death. Demara died June 7, 1982, at the age of 60 due to heart failure and complications from diabetes, which had required both his legs to be amputated. According to his obituary in the New York Times, he had been living in Orange County, California for 8 years. He died at Nielsen's home in Anaheim, California. Demara's story was recounted in the 1960 book The Great Imposter, written by Robert Crichton and published at Random House. The book was a New York Times bestseller and adopted in 1961 film by the same name starring Tony Curtis as Demara. A second book by Crichton, The Rascal and the Road, recounted Demara and Crichton's experiences together as Crichton conducted research for The Great Imposter. Demara understood the importance of finding a power vacuum and filling it. At universities, rather than joining an existing professor's committee and fighting for control, he would just start his own committee. His goal was never to seize power, but to find power that others didn't want and take advantage of it. He was like a businessman who understood the importance of exploring new markets rather than competing in the old ones. There's no denying that Demara was a genius. Even though he was an imposter, he did great things during his lifetime. He reformed a prison, founded a school, and saved many lives. He made some powerful friends among politicians and movie stars, and in his later years survived by their generosity. He inspired a 1960 movie starring Tony Curtis and a 1990 television series called The Pretender. During Demara's careers, his impersonations included a ship's doctor, a civil engineer, a sheriff's deputy, an assistant prison warden, a doctor of applied psychology, a hospital orderly, a lawyer, a child care expert, a Benedictine monk, a Trappist monk, an editor, a cancer researcher, and a teacher. That one teaching job led to 6 months in prison. He never seemed to seek or get much monetary gain in what he was doing, just temporary respectability. Many of Demara's unsuspecting employers, under other circumstances, would have been satisfied with Demara as an employee. Frank was said to possess a true photographic memory and was widely reputed to have an extraordinary IQ. He was apparently able to memorize necessary techniques from textbooks and worked on 2 cardinal rules. The burden of proof is on the accuser, and when in danger, attack. He described his own motivation as rascality, pure rascality. Some folks will lie to get ahead. Others will lie to achieve some position of power. I think Fred was looking for respectability, only using shortcuts to get it. You can look at him as being a con man, or you can look at him as being a thrill seeker. He wanted something better in life than what he had, and he didn't have the patience to get the training needed to do what he wanted. Demara wasn't the only successful imposter. There have been many. This one had a movie made about his life as well. Born April 27, 1948, Frank Abagnale Jr. became very close to his father, Frank Sr. His folks got a divorce, and when he could, Frank Jr. would go everywhere with his dad, including business meetings. Frank Sr. was the first victim of his con artist son. When he was 15, he called various gas stations and told the owners to ring him up for merchandise, things like tires and cans of oil. He then turned around and he sold the products to other gas stations well below their value. After doing this for a month, his father got a bill for $3,400 in the mail. That's about $13,000 today. Frank Sr. was already in bad financial shape, and this nearly bankrupted him. Frank Jr. was sent to a school for troubled boys. He didn't much care for living conditions there, and so at 16 he left the school and home, looking to make his own way. His first job paid $1.50 an hour. Frank thought this was due to his age, so he altered his ID to make him 10 years older. Having a knack for forging, Frank began forging checks. He also wrote hot checks, cashing them all over town, even if he didn't have any money in his account. This was only doable as long as his bank didn't close his account, which happened just about every month. Frank had noticed a lot of bank customers didn't fill out their deposit slips. They would hand them to the clerk, who would fill in all the numbers at the bottom. The clerk never paid any attention to whether the handwriting was the same, so Frank grabbed a handful of blank deposit slips, filled in the blank space at the bottom with his account number, and then put them back in the slot of the desk in the lobby. This netted him $42,000 in just one day. He also noticed that he would have better success catching his bad checks if he looked like somebody in authority, someone who might come and go on a varying schedule. Abagnale contacted Pan American World Airlines and told them that he was a pilot who had lost his uniform when it was being cleaned at a hotel. He used a fake employee ID to complete the con, and he forged a Federal Aviation Administration pilot's license. Abagnale had to collect his uniform at the airport, and he was terrified that people working there would discover he was still just a teenager. He posed as a businessman to get a security badge and then pretended to be a pilot named Frank Williams in order to get his FAA license. If you work for an airline, you can fly anywhere in the world for free. You simply took any seat not sold, what's called standby. Now, holding a Pan Am ID and uniform, Frank would sign on for standby seats and fly all over the place. He was able to fly over 250 times. To add credibility to his disguise, he recruited some college girls to pose as stewardesses so they could accompany him on these free trips. When pilots would see him in the passenger compartment, they would invite him into the cockpit. On one occasion, the pilot offered him the controls. Frank sat in the pilot's seat acting like he was flying, but he kept the autopilot engaged because he couldn't drive a car, let alone fly a plane. His luck nearly ran out, and Frank had to sneak away when the authorities began to suspect he wasn't really a pilot. Frank forged papers saying he was a doctor. Once again, going by the name Frank Williams, he managed to get hired as a pediatrician working in a hospital in Georgia. After 11 months, Frank went looking for a new thrill. I wonder why he kept using the same name. He studied law at home, and then he claimed to be a Harvard Law School graduate. He sat for the bar exam in Louisiana. After a few tries, he managed to pass the exam, and then he was a certified lawyer. He went and got a job working as an assistant in a law firm. One of the others working there began looking into Frank's story about Harvard and being a lawyer, so he snuck away once more. Eventually, he wound up in Montpellier, France, where he once again started writing bad checks. There were now several law enforcement agencies looking for him. One of the real stewardesses he had dated saw a wanted poster with his photo on it. She knew where he was hiding, and she dropped a dime. For those of you who don't know what that means, back years ago, if you wanted to give the authorities information on somebody hiding out, the safest way to do this was by using a payphone. It used to cost 10 cents, one thin dime, to call the police, so you would drop a dime in the slot. Frank Abagnale served jail time in France, Sweden, and the United States. He tried to escape while being transferred from Sweden to the U.S. He did manage to escape from the airport, and he slipped into Canada. The RCMP caught him and sent him back. During a stint in federal detention center in Georgia, Abagnale pretended to be an undercover prison inspector. He convinced other prisoners, who in turn let the guards know, that he was there to keep an eye on the staff. The guards saw to it Frank received better food, fewer chores, and no harassment from anyone. After a few weeks, Frank told one of the guards he was wrapping up his investigation and he needed to contact his boss at the FBI. He placed a call that was monitored by the jail staff to his girlfriend, who pretended to be an FBI agent. During their scripted conversation, she told Frank it was time for him to come into the office and file his report. The staff of the jail were all glad to escort him to the front gate and out of the building, thinking they had passed their inspection. His girlfriend met him out front, and they drove away. Once the staff discovered they had helped a prisoner escape, a quick cover-up was initiated, but it only lasted a short time. Too many people knew what had happened, many of them prisoners. Frank was able to avoid recapture by pretending to be an FBI agent. Eventually, the real FBI caught up with him. Frank was sentenced to serve several years in prison, but he was released early under an agreement that he would teach the feds how to recognize con artists in the future. Today, Abagnale and Associates works out of Oklahoma. The organization advises companies on fraud, and some 15,000 businesses have adopted his anti-fraud measures. To this day, Abagnale works with the FBI and teaches at their academy. Today, use of the wide word. Today, use of the wide. I've got that wrong again. Today, use of computers makes fraud a little more difficult. It's more complicated is all. There's still plenty of fraud out there. It's just you can't walk into a business and say that you're a certified something or other, because all they got to do is look on the computer for your history. And it's out there. If you enjoyed the show, tell your friends they should enjoy it as well. If you'd like to contact me, send your notes to strangethings@arkanasa.com. If you want to show off your listening to the show. You can find t shirts, coffee cups, book bags, all kinds of cool stuff at tpublic.com. Just look for Strange Things with Chris James and check out some of the merchandise. Maybe you'll find something you like for Christmas or somebody's birthday. If you want to find my books, they're all available at Amazon.com, and books make good Christmas presents as well. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?